I think this has started, and in that hope, first, hi, welcome. What I'd like to do today is three things. First, to give you a little bit of background about who I am, then talk about the book, and then finally answer any questions. So starting with a brief version of me, I was born in New York. I was educated in undergraduate at Columbia, and I got my PhD at Brown. I taught at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana for 4 years. And then I moved to Scotland, where a new university was being set up, the University of Stirling. And I taught there until I retired, helped to establish the department. In terms of research, most of my career research was done with animals, first with rhesus monkeys, then rats and pigeons. And that research was supported by the National Science Foundation in the US. And then when I moved to Britain, by the British equivalent, which was then the Science and Engineering Research Council. Later in my career, my research shifted to humans, and I had a grant from the Social Science Research Council to study student evaluations of teaching, how accurate students were and how valid their ratings were. In terms of teaching, while I was at Illinois, I was rated as the most stimulating teacher in psychology by graduating seniors in a poll conducted by the university for 2 of the 4 years that I was there. And then when I moved to Stirling, my course has fairly consistently been rated with the highest ratings in psychology. So that's sort of who I am. And in terms of the book, I've always had 2 fundamental goals in all the books I've written, that they be stimulating and that they be enjoyable. So starting with the idea of being stimulating, what I've wanted to do is to encourage students to think critically, to look at evidence, to be able to evaluate evidence for themselves rather than just being told by somebody else what it is. One issue for all authors of textbooks is the question of depth versus breadth. It's not an either or. You have to have both, but it's a question of how you strike the balance between the two. And my bias throughout my career has been towards depth. I think students get more from a deep understanding, from a real understanding of a selected range of questions and issues than from a superficial familiarity with a lot of issues. I would much rather they get to really understand logic and thinking and look closely at things. Okay. One example of how I've implemented that approach in this textbook, it concerns experiments and the experimental method. And so the first chapter in the text is entirely devoted to the assumptions underlying research, underlying the research that will be discussed in the rest of the text. So that first chapter looks at basic assumptions that I think all researchers make about, first of all, that there are laws of behavior, that it's worth trying to look for them, that the best way to discover those laws in general is to do experiments, and about the role of animals in psychological research. To what extent is it desirable to use them, and what are problems involved? Okay, so the text begins with a very strong introduction about the assumptions underlying research. And then throughout the text, what I've done is to select what I think are the most important issues and experiments, and to try to look more closely at them. So instead of trying to cover everything, and cover all experiments on an issue, to try to home in on what I see as the most important experiments. And for those experiments, not just giving the conclusions, but trying to go a bit into what is the logic of the experiment? How did they use control groups to eliminate alternative explanations, and so on. I've taken a similar approach to theories, and the example that I think is easiest to see is in classical conditioning. There are lots of good theories of classical conditioning, but to me, the best theory, the most influential theory, is the Rescorla-Wagner model. So instead of trying to say a little bit about all the different theories, I've tried to take students really into the Rescorla-Wagner model to help them understand how a theory actually works and how you evaluate a theory. Okay. What the Rescorla-Wagner model does, or what I try to do with it, is to show how a few simple assumptions can explain a surprising number of phenomena. And I immediately have to add a caveat. I said simple assumptions, and I think they are. I don't think you can have a simpler theory than the Rescorla-Wagner model. The basic assumption is the least complicated you can possibly have. But it's stated in mathematical form, and that for students is scary. So underlying it at its core is a simple idea, but it can be really hard for students to understand. So what I've tried to do is to introduce assumptions gradually, to go slowly, to clearly explain what the model is doing, why it works the way it does. For this edition, I've tried to further streamline it. So one thing I've done is to reduce the number of phenomena that I try to explain, to try to, again, focus. Well, by reducing phenomena, there are less things the students have to understand. There are less equations they have to follow, to try to get it down to the core, the smallest number of ideas that a student needs to understand in order to really see how a theory works and how this theory works. Reviewers have thankfully been very positive about the version in this edition. So two of the reviewers said that the Rescorla-Wagner coverage was excellent. And one of them wrote, "I love the rewrite, clean, clear, much more digestible for an undergraduate course." My hope is that even if a student doesn't take in all the details and all the formulas, that still what they'll emerge from the discussion with is some sense of how theories actually work, that it's not arcane, it's not mysterious, that there's certain basic steps in creating a theory, using a theory, evaluating a theory, that I hope students will get some sort of feeling for what a theory is about, and for at least some students, that they'll actually find it exciting to see how a theory can really do so much and produce fundamentally counterintuitive, surprising predictions. Having said all that, it is still the case. This is not a model for everybody. And so what I've done in this edition is to move the discussion of the model to the end of the chapter on conditioning theories, so that for any course, any instructor who wants to skip it, it's now easy to skip. And leaving it out will not impair understanding of any of the material in subsequent chapters. But where it isn't appropriate, it's now easy to omit it. So I've said that one of my goals is that the text be stimulating. Second, again, is that it be enjoyable. And I've tried very hard to write clearly, where possible, entertainingly, and even where possible, humorously. I want the text to feel like an enjoyable conversation rather than a formal lecture. That it's not somebody talking down to you and you're memorizing what they're saying, but you're sort of talking about it. You're engaged in a conversation. One way to do that, at least one of the ways that I've tried to do it, is by having a lot of material on applications. Students inevitably, understandably, are going to be far more interested in hearing about treatments for, say, drug addiction than they are about a rat pressing a bar to get a food pellet. So when you have applications involving people, it's much easier for students to get involved and to care about what they're reading. So I've tried throughout the text to interweave material in every chapter, interweave material on applications and principles. And just to give you some examples, to give a feeling for it, in the case of conditioning, some of the applications covered involve treatments for phobias, treatments for addictions. In reinforcement, one of the applications that I devote a lot of space to is Lobos's work on autism, which I find very, very impressive. I don't know how many of you have seen films of what he's done, but it is touching to see the changes in the students, and research has supported that approach, and a lot of it is discussed in the text. Another thing that's discussed in the reinforcement chapter, again, another application, usually the learning texts talk about how reinforcement can strengthen behavior. And I give a lot of examples of where reinforcement can be used positively in a really helpful, positive way. But reinforcement in some respects can also have harmful effects. And so there's an extended discussion about the debate about can reinforcement reduce intrinsic motivation. I think that debate has actually been settled, and it's been settled quite neatly and positively, and there's considerable consensus now. But anyway, that material is there. In the case of punishment, I have a whole chapter on punishment, which looks in some detail at what determines whether punishment works. Will punishment suppress a behavior? And what are the side effects? Are there side effects of punishment that might make you want to hesitate about using it? So what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? In the case of memory, some of the applications discuss one that comes up repeatedly is techniques for improving studying. Another application that's covered is eyewitness testimony. So is it accurate? Can jurors believe what eyewitnesses recall? And can it be improved? What techniques can we use to make eyewitnesses more accurate in what they recall? And another application covered, which I think is a poignant topic, recovered memories. So when an adult suddenly remembers having been abused as a child, after not remembering this for years, can you believe that account? Is it really plausible that a child could be traumatized for years and then totally forget about it, and then it returns? And I look again in some detail and some depth at the evidence about it. I think the answer is some recovered memories are accurate. They are believable, but there are some that are false, and it is a problem how to know for any memory, which is it. Okay, so I try to use applications. A related theme, guiding principle for me, is to try to use human research wherever possible. That does not mean ignoring animal research. As I said earlier, most of my career has been spent doing animal research. All fundamental animal research on learning is in the text. What I mean by focusing on human research is that where there's a choice, where you could introduce a principle, an idea with either an animal experiment or a human experiment, every time I will go for the human experiment. Students, I think, can relate better to human research. Okay. So I've tried to make the text stimulating and enjoyable. What I want to move on to is changes for the second edition. But one that I've already covered is the Rescorla-Wagner model, where I both simplified it and moved it to the end of the chapter. Another major change concerns the coverage of neural network models. The previous edition did have, the final chapter had a lot of material on neural networks. But since that edition was published, there's been a lot more research has appeared using an approach called deep learning. It's a modification of basic neural network models. And some of the achievements of that deep learning approach I find spectacular. So just to give a few examples, one that I really just enjoy. They trained a neural network model by giving it photographs of a variety of scenes. And for each photograph, they also provided a caption, a possible caption, explaining what was in the scene. So the network was given lots and lots and lots of these photographs and captions, trained on them. Then in the test phase, the network was exposed to a new set of photographs. And the question was, how accurately would they be able to caption? How accurately would the network be able to tell you, well, this is what's in the photographs? And so, for example, one of the test photographs involved a woman throwing a frisbee to her son, and there were trees in the background. And the caption that the network produced was, a woman throwing a frisbee in a park. That to me is astonishing. A neural network is just a bunch of neurons interconnected. All the neurons are connected in a simple model. All the neurons are simply connected to each other. They're just on or off. They send messages to each other. The graded message. There is no intelligence. There is no understanding. There is no structure. It is a dumb set of neurons. I mean, somehow that set of neurons is able to act as if there was a person actually inside the model, and that person is looking at the photograph. They can figure out what all the different elements, all the different pixels, they can figure out what is being shown in the photograph, and not only figure out, but then give you a caption in grammatical English accurately saying what's there. Again, I don't know if I'm strange in this or not, but I just find that quite remarkable. That idea, the deep learning approach, has already appeared in extensive applications all over the place, especially in medicine. One example that's covered in the text is diagnosis of skin cancer. So a network was given a large set of photographs of people's skin, and it was told for each photograph whether or not the person actually did have skin cancer. So it's given extensive training. Now we come to the test phase, where again, some new photographs are shown. And the question is, will the network be able to give you an accurate diagnosis? Can it tell you whether the person has skin cancer? And the network's performance was compared to that of a group of experienced dermatologists. The result was that the network outperformed the dermatologists. The network, the deep learning network, was correct on 95% of the photographs it saw. The dermatologists were correct on 87%. These networks are remarkable in their ability to evaluate evidence. And some of you I suspect most of you are already familiar with the ability of networks to beat world champions. One breakthrough was when they beat the world champion in chess. It may then have been Kasparov. They've beaten world champions in checkers. And they've beaten world champions in Go, which is a Chinese game that my understanding is it is the most difficult game, the most demanding test for any kind of program, because there are so many possible moves within Go. You cannot do it by brute force, by just having a computer just try every possible move. You can't do it. But neural networks have beaten human champions in chess. So here is this, to me, really impressive range of sophisticated behaviors that these networks can perform. And they are all based on the one simple principle that when two neurons are active, two units in the network, when two neurons are active at the same time, the connection between them is strengthened. One simple idea. And then there are various bits built around it, but that is the core idea of neural networks. Two units active at the same time, the connection between them is strengthened. It is the same idea that Pavlov put forward 100 years ago to explain dogs salivating. It is the same idea that the Rescorla-Wagner model incorporated. And the formula that the Rescorla-Wagner model used is actually identical to the formula that's used in a lot of neural network models. The same idea, 100 years, and it is still showing over and over the power of just simple processes to explain complex behavior. Okay, to try to be clear about this, the claim, or certainly my claim, is not that these neural networks are identical to the brain. The brain is a far more sophisticated organism. There's far more structure built into it, but that we may have uncovered one of the core principles underlying how the brain works. But it seems, as you first approach psychology, how is it conceivable that a brain, just this bunch of neurons sending electrical signals to each other, how could they possibly produce thought, consciousness, any of this stuff? And what neural networks to me suggest is it's actually possible. And we may be getting at one of the core principles. Okay. Three other changes that I'll mention just briefly in the new edition. One is there's a new section on motor learning. I've expanded the section on habituation, and I've added critical questions for the students throughout the text. So the idea is to encourage students to take the ideas that they've just read about and to think about how they relate to their own lives. So the questions work in various ways, but the basic idea is, instead of them just passively reading the material, to stop, to pause as they're going along, and to think about, well, that's what's there in the text. How does that relate to me? How does that relate to my life, to people I know, and so on? Right. What I'd like to do now is to turn to questions and to try to answer questions. Some questions were submitted before the session, and I'm going to go through them. And then if any of you have questions after I finish that, I gather you've got a bit on your screen where you can write down questions and they will be sent to me. But starting with the ones that were submitted beforehand, and I'll just read them. First question, just put this so I can see it. First question, hi David. I find students engage well when I teach them about long-term memory by giving examples of case studies in cognitive neuropsychology. Short-term learning and memory are more theoretical. Any tips, please? Well, in terms of learning, I've already talked about what I try to do to make them more interesting. So covering human research, covering applications, and so forth. And then you're specifically asking about a question about short-term memory. One approach, which I'm sure you're already using, is neurological evidence. So HM, who had impaired long-term memory, KF, who had impaired short-term memory, is sort of dramatic and interesting. These are real people. And to hear and learn about how this affected their lives. So one thing is indeed to use neurological evidence. Another thing that I've tried to do in my sections on this is to introduce interesting findings wherever I could possibly squeeze them in. One that I like concerns memory span. So as I think you all know, the classic that people can remember 7 words, 7 digits, so on, 7 plus or minus 2. And that finding has been replicated over and over, except if you use Chinese people as the participants, their memory span is 9.9. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that Chinese are just smarter than all the rest of us? Well, maybe. But I think the more likely explanation comes from Baddeley's model and the idea of a phonological loop, the idea that one bit of our memory is like a tape recorder. It's like a loop that goes round and round and can hold 2 seconds worth of material. So why did Chinese have able to remember more words or whatever as they're presented? And the simple answer could be they talk faster, and therefore more material can be stored on that short-term loop. So that's one possible, can be interesting idea you can use. It's been applied to areas like dyslexia. The history of dyslexia until moderately recently was anyone who suffered from it was just regarded as being stupid. The poor, they can't learn, the dumb. And we've gradually learned that that's not the case. And one reason it's not the case, one reason they may have difficulty is that the problem is in their phonological loop, how many items they can store in short-term memory. So instead of it being a total breakdown of intelligence, it's simply one little bit of memory is just not working quite the way we would like. Another application like that I've used is talking about consolidation, that after you have some input going into short-term memory, that has to be worked on, it has to be consolidated, strengthened to last in long-term memory. And one example that I use is football players who study football players who suffered concussion. And then you find that they can't remember the last 30 seconds before they were hit. So they haven't had time to consolidate the memory. So just throwing in interesting tidbits where you can. A second question, what unique contribution does your book make to the literature? How is your book different than, say, Memory by Baddeley et al.? And I'm grateful to whoever submitted that question. I really enjoyed it because it got me thinking about in what ways might my text be unique. One that I've already covered is my attempts to combine it being stimulating, to encourage thinking, to look deeply, but also to try to make it entertaining, enjoyable to read. Mine is not the only text that has ever done that, but I think it's moderately rare to have a text that's able to successfully combine the two. So one in which my text, I think, is somewhat unique, is in combining those two approaches. The second is in its coverage of neural networks. And as I think may have come across already, I think neural networks are really exciting, and I would argue the most important single development in the last decade in psychology, and may prove to be one of the most important developments in the history of psychology. So here is this huge discovery. It is barely covered in undergraduate textbooks for basic introductory courses and things like learning and memory. I would claim, based on what I've seen, and maybe I'm wrong about this, if I am, I apologize, but I honestly believe that the coverage of neural networks in this text is the best available anywhere, in the sense of being clear, because this can get very complicated, being clear and being able to see how powerful these models can actually be, and being up to date on some of the applications that are made. I think students, I hope, will emerge from reading that chapter with a real interest and appreciation of neural networks. Another way in which I believe that the text is unique is in its combination of cognitive and behavioral approaches. So as I said at the beginning, I was an undergraduate at Columbia, and Columbia at that time was a hotbed of behaviors. And it was this, outside of Harvard, it was the single most important place for training Skinnerians, behavioral psychologists. One of the teachers there, most influential in that approach, was Nate Schoenfeld. And I absolutely adored his teaching. I even went voluntarily in evenings to attend one of his evening classes just to watch him teach. I loved it. Later on, I encountered Tolman's ideas, and my own thinking shifted quite strongly, and I became a cognitive psychologist. I find the cognitive approach much more persuasive. But I still have enormous respect for what Skinnerians, the ABA group and so on, for what they've achieved, by following their narrower focus, by really looking at how the environment shapes behavior. I think they produce some really lovely and important research. So I've tried to cover both in the text, and a lot of the applications that are covered within conditioning and reinforcement, especially reinforcement, do come from that behavioral tradition. One example of the integration of the two approaches, and which I think really is unique in this text, involves reinforcement. So the way most texts cover learning, reinforcement within learning, is to focus on how reinforcement can strengthen behavior and how you learn that this response will produce that reward. There is relatively less focus within most texts on performance. So you've learned that a certain response produces a reward. Well, now, do you perform that response? You've got a choice of behaviors. You have many responses that produce lots of different outcomes. How do you choose which of these many responses to perform? And now within the theories of reinforcement chapter, I cover the matching law, which is Bernstein's work. It's a very behavioral Skinnerian approach. No messing around with what's going inside a human or pigeon's head, but just here's the equation that shows matching. So I talk about the behavioral approach to understanding performance and rates of reinforcement, and also Tversky and Kahneman's research on heuristics. So again, how do people make choices? How do they make decisions? And I think both approaches have validity, and you can look at both. You can learn from both. Okay, the question also asks specifically about Badley and his text on memory. And I'll say immediately, I love his texts. I think everybody knows he's a wonderful researcher. He's also a wonderful writer. I just enjoy reading him. There's a problem, though, in his more recent texts, and specifically the last version of the memory text. For whatever reason, I think he's oriented them to a somewhat different audience. They're now much more detailed. They're much more appropriate for professionals. If you were teaching a graduate course on memory, I don't think you can do better than that. If you were teaching an undergraduate course and your aim was to prepare students to go out and be memory researchers, I don't think you can do better than that. But if what you want to do is to introduce students to memory, to get them interested in it, to give them a feel for what the field has discovered, what's around, what the kinds of ideas, applications, then I think my text is worth considering. And that actually leads me to a more general point, because I think that this applies to everything I do when I'm writing. One approach in textbooks, learning in other textbooks, is to try to prepare students for graduate school, to try to get them to know all the kinds of phenomena and facts and definitions that they might need if they were a graduate student. That is not my approach. My approach, the contrast is to be simplified, maybe oversimplified. I don't want to prepare students for graduate school. Most of them are not going to go to graduate school. They're going to forget most of the facts they learn. What I want to do is to get students interested in going to graduate school, to get them interested in the material, to find it exciting, to try to understand how all these aspects of human behavior work. Okay. Next question. Does multimodal input work well for everyone, or can it be counterproductive for some? And I have to immediately say I am not an expert in that area. I can say with some trepidation, some caution, I did once for other reasons, not for the text, for other reasons, I did try to look at some of the research on multimodal. My impression, for what it's worth, at that time was that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what modality you use. What's important is teaching clearly and well. And the modality which you use is not important. I didn't spend a huge amount of time. Maybe I picked that up wrong. Maybe research since then has changed. All I can say is that my impression then was that it isn't important. The next question. Do we have any recent studies of how all the anxieties around COVID and the political situation in many countries have impacted people's ability to retrieve information? And I would boil that down, simplify that to how does anxiety affect memory, and how anxiety about COVID affect memory. I actually did research on at one point in my career on the effects of anxiety on human memory. And I got a very neat result, and I was hopeful of getting a publication out of it. And we replicated it, didn't get the same result. Over the years, a number of students working with me tried replicating it. There was no pattern. The results went all over. I just couldn't figure out what was going on, why we were getting different results. I later discovered that is the generality, that is the general conclusion in a lot of this area. You get enormous disparities in the results you find when you try to manipulate anxiety and see the effects on memory. My impression of that field now is some of the reasons for the disparities are simply that different studies use different techniques, different memory tests, and so on. And that can account for a fair amount of why they're getting different results. But another very powerful factor is the intensity of the anxiety. You get very different effects depending on how strongly anxious somebody is. And there's a study that I cover in the text, one of the most striking studies that I've encountered in psychology, unusual. There's a study that was reported by Morgan involving the US Army. And the Army has a training camp preparing soldiers for survival skills. I don't remember, I haven't had a chance to go back to look at the original study. I assume the soldiers came from units like the Green Berets, that these were elite soldiers, and they were being prepared for how they would survive if they would, for example, if they were captured. So they were trained in interrogation techniques, how to resist interrogation. And they had a very stringent, demanding way of doing it. So the soldiers would be food deprived for 48 hours, deprived of sleep for 48 hours. And they would then have 2 interrogation sessions of 40 minutes each. And during those sessions, they had to stand as they were being interrogated. Now, all that was bad enough, but they also had a high stress group in which they had to look at the interrogator's face throughout the interrogation. And if at any point their eyes left the interrogator, they were physically punished. Enormous stress. The interrogator did their face 4 or 5 inches away, punishing them the moment they stopped looking at them. It was a horrific situation. But again, it was something the Army was doing anyway. What Morgan added on to it was then testing the soldiers' memory, later testing their memory for what happened during the session. And they found dramatic, overwhelming effects. For example, the soldiers who participated could not remember the interrogator. If they were shown a lineup with the interrogator present, they couldn't pick out the interrogator. They had been with the interrogator for something like 90 minutes in their face, and they couldn't remember him. The memory was really impaired as a result of this incredibly high stress. How do we apply that to COVID? I don't know. Worrying about COVID is I don't think, anything like as stressful for most of us as what these soldiers endured. So what is the level of stress? What kind of memory or retrieval are we talking about? I don't think we know. I can't really answer the question except to say that we do know that extreme stress has damaging effects, and moderately high stress will certainly affect people in a variety of ways, including distraction. They're going off to think about what they're worried about and so forth. Okay, the next question was, what chapter should I ask students to start with? In my course, I always start with chapter 1. I mean, students should get coverage in basic ideas of experimental methods, control groups, controlling for passage of time, and so forth. First of all, I don't think they always get full coverage of these things, and what they do get, I don't think all of them fully absorb. So I think it is worth going over these things. And some of the ideas here are not covered in introductory. So is behavior lawful? Are there really laws out there? I mean, most of us, I think, believe one way or another to one degree or another in free will. So what is this idea? What is this claim that there really are laws of behavior? How lawful is behavior? And I think unless you really have a pretty high commitment to the idea that behavior is lawful, if there aren't many laws out there, why would you spend a lot of time trying to study it? So that assumption that behavior is lawful, I think, is critical. And I think it's critical that students understand it. I don't try to tell them this is something you have to accept, but just to understand why some people do believe that behavior is lawful. Why do they believe that experiments are the best way to obtain the data that we need? Experiments can be artificial. The process takes forever. Some of the variables being looked at seem trivial. All kinds of problems with experiments. Well, why do experimenters nevertheless use it? And again, the role of animals. So, okay, I personally start with the first chapter, and I think it's worth doing. But if your time limit or you just don't think that information is needed, then my suggestion would be to start with chapter 2 on classical conditioning. And the final question that was submitted before this talk, can you explain some of the resources that I can use for your book, especially to prepare for exams? I'm not sure quite what the questioner was getting at. If they mean especially prepare for exams, if they mean for them to prepare an exam, then I prepared a test bank with lots of multiple choice and fill-in questions, and that will be available to adapters of a text. Cambridge is also going to make available an instructor's manual I prepared. They're going to make available slides or whatever of all the illustrations used and so forth. I hope I'm answering what you asked. Okay, that's the material that I had in advance. So you can type in questions, they'll be sent on to Cambridge, and I'll try to answer them. One question is, what types of courses or professionals should use this book? Certainly, the most obvious answer is courses on learning, memory, or learning and memory. in each case, if it was just a learning course, just a memory course, there are books that would be giving you more material than I am. But you might consider that some of the strengths of the book about clarity, about probing things deeply, make it worthwhile. So I know some people have used it in straight learning courses. Sorry, my voice has gone down. I know some people have used it, used the text in straight learning courses and have used it successfully. About professionals, I would say, I don't just have to think off the top of my head, people who do applied clinical work, who use things like treatments for phobias, do work with children involving punishment. The chapter on punishment is very extensively covering child research and the advantages and the dangers of using punishment. So I guess applied professionals who do applied research trying to help people is what comes to mind. Okay. Are there any other questions? There's another one. I think I'm going to be fed the questions one at a time. Are there any external tools or resources that students should use with this book, such as reference books? I might change my mind if I thought about it more. My first reaction is no, but I would hope that I've covered everything that a student needs and that they can understand it just by reading it. For example, there are definitions, the important definitions are all put in bold, and the definitions wouldn't change in this edition. Instead of putting them at the end of the chapter, or as I've done sometimes in the past, put them at the end of the whole book, the definitions are now given at the end of each section. If the section has a new definition, it's in bold, and then the definition is given at the formal definition is given at the end of the section. So it can serve as first of all, as a reminder, getting them thinking again about what they were just reading, what is recovered memory, and what have you been told about it. And so I would hope that they don't need any other reference source. Goodbye, and thank you for coming along.